All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This webinar series has been convened by the Critical Zone Network, CZN, Early Career Network, in partnership with the Critical Zone Collaborative Network. This is the first series of a number of series that the CZN Early Career Network has planned with the goal of enhancing collaboration and synthesis across CZ Observatory and Watershed sites. Welcome to the fifth week of this CUAHSI Fall Cyber Seminar Series, Introduction to the Critical Zone Observatories and Watershed Sites. This six-part series will continue each week at this same time until next week, which is actually the final session. My name is Lisa Muchachito, and I am the Community Relations Specialist for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is the consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like this cyber seminar series. CUAHSI also serves as the national coordinating hub for the Critical Zone Collaborative Network, or CZCN. We are thankful to members of the CZ network team for their contributions to this series. I would encourage you to reach out to me or visit our website. You can sign up for our newsletter or join our community Slack channel to learn more about CUAHSI or to get involved. And I'm going to add all this information into the chat in just a few moments. And before we get started, a few logistical things. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later this afternoon. Secondly, we ask that you please use the Q&A functionality to submit your questions for panelists. And finally, we expect that everyone involved with CUAHSI cyber seminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. So thank you again for joining us, and to the CZN Early Career Network for putting together a fantastic lineup of presenters. And today's session will be about lakes, wetlands, and streams. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to CZN Early Career Network Steering Committee member and research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Bhavna Arora.
Thank you, Lisa. Can I share my screen? Oh, perfect. So welcome, everyone. I don't have much to share today, except that a very warm welcome to all the panelists and folks for joining us here for week 5 of our webinar series. And just to reiterate for those that are new here, that the purpose of this Critical Zone series is really to introduce us mutually to the different Critical Zone sites and networks, really towards an eye, for increasing synthesis opportunities and collaboration across these many networks and sites. So the Early Career Group has been working and thinking a lot about advancing these modes of collaboration. And in that same vein, we've launched a special issue call for WRR in Earth's Future, thinking about what are those next generation infrastructure tools and open science opportunities that would enable us to have more cross-site integration and, really thinking about transferable insights and findings and broadly applicable questions, tools, and approaches. And last but not the least, the Early Career Group is also beyond these fall cyber seminar series. We have another series coming up, also hosted by CUAHSI, where we are going to be talking about tools and approaches for integrating and synthesizing the data from across these many critical zone sites and watershed sites. We also have an AGU workshop coming up in December. And the registration for that is now open. I'll share the link in the chat. Again, all of these wouldn't have been possible without our senior advisors and a lot of my early career cohorts here. So with that, I do want to pass this on to today's facilitators, Adam and Pam.
Great, thank you, Bhavna, and thank you everyone for joining us today for our fifth session focused on lakes, wetlands, and streams. And we do have a great lineup of talks today, ranging across geoclimatic regions, countries, and ecosystems. In preparation for the talks today, we asked our speakers to consider 3 prompts, and these prompts included: what are the biggest changes you're seeing at your sites? And are these findings transferable to other areas or other sites? What are the key drivers of these changes? Can these influential parameters and the conceptual models that you've built be tested in other regions? And lastly, how are you engaging global communities in your research? How are you sharing data, models, and findings? So that was kind of our framework going in here. And as one last reminder, please use the Q&A function for questions. And if you direct those questions to a speaker, that's great. Just make sure that that's clearly stated in the beginning of your question. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our first speaker, John Kominoski from Florida International University. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Adam and Pam. Thanks all of y'all for being here. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So I'm going to give you an overview of the work that we're doing at the Florida Coastal Everglades Long-Term Ecological Research Program in South Florida. I'm the lead PI of this amazing program that is now starting its 22nd year. In general, we're trying to understand disturbances and legacies that are interacting with long-term environmental changes in coastal wetlands. Some of the big drivers of our system are sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, of course, tropical cyclones, freshwater availability. We have drought and flood issues, as well as restoration of fresh water, which is, for those of you that don't know, the Everglades is the world's largest restoration effort in scale and in expense. And also we have a very active fire management plan. It's the first national park to have a fire management plan. So fire is critical to our ecosystem. So what are the biggest challenges you're seeing at your sites, and are these findings transferable to other areas and other sites? And I say yes. The Everglades is a bit of an end member. It is one of the world's most phosphorus limited ecosystems, but it incorporates many different types of ecosystems: estuaries, coastal mangroves, brackish and freshwater wetlands that are all connected by lakes and streams. So we definitely foresee that the work that we do in the Everglades is transferable to other ecosystems, especially other coastal wetland ecosystems in the Caribbean. So what are the key drivers of changes, and can these influence parameters or our conceptual model be tested in other regions? We use a couple of theoretical frameworks to drive and motivate our research in the Everglades. We use Odom's theory of ecosystem development, which is highlighted here on the left and expanded upon, to test for how changing hydrologic presses and pulses, both from fresh and marine water sources, are influencing whether systems become pulsed stable, develop, or decline. And in general, whether we can maintain vegetated systems in coastal areas or whether they become open water. I'm going to skip through the last part of that slide and just give you a few highlights of challenges. Presses and pulses of marine and fresh water have both pros and cons. They can be beneficial to the development of ecosystems, as the case here on the left-hand side, where marine pulses coming in from Hurricane Irma in 2017 caused a major storm surge to deposit a large amount of phosphorus-rich sediment, which fertilized our coastal mangroves, causing phosphorus to be taken up, carbon to be stored, and elevation of soil to be gained. However, just interior from our coastal mangroves, we have very vulnerable and increasingly collapsing brackish peat wetlands. So this illustration here shows on the left-hand side a natural peat soil that is laying on top of very porous limestone next to a very degraded and lost elevation wetland. And basically through experimental manipulations, we have detected that when these marshes get exposed to salt, they reduce their root biomass, and that causes peat to collapse and elevation to decline. We're basically studying two main drainages, Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough, along freshwater marshes, mangroves, and estuaries. And we're looking at the carbon sink strength and the connectivity among these very different but connected hydrologic ecosystems. Just to give you a sense of what's happening interior, as I mentioned, freshwater restoration, this large blue arrow here, is pushing some of the largest amounts of water that this region has seen in the last 100 years, which is noted here by this increase, although it might not be a visible increase to you. We are increasing water levels throughout the Everglades, fresh and marine portions of the Everglades. That's causing a transformation in our sawgrass biomass. It's actually declining, which is in some ways an indicator of positive restoration effort. This is what our interior wetlands look like, this aerial view where a bridge is raising up and allowing water to flow south, which is increasing the water in our canals that are main hydrologic heads for our freshwater wetlands. And this image showing you prior to a major restoration effort of freshwater and the distribution of hydroperiod, the number of days when a wetland has water above the surface, this big blue inky blob is increasing in its spatial extent, which is another indicator of restoration success. We are also studying the role of fire, and basically we know that fire can enhance carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus storage. This is showing us that fire that returns every 2 to 15 years maximizes phosphorus storage in our wetlands. So long-term, we're looking at interactions of these multiple drivers. These blue arrows are hurricanes, the red fire, and the black and gray are droughts and floods and cold snaps. And long story short, we can see long-term signatures in our water chemistry throughout this large landscape with respect to certain events that trigger certain increases in carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water column heterotrophy. How are we engaging global communities with our research? Well, we've written books, we're informing the National Academies of Science, we're engaging with artists to illustrate our research. We're part of networks such as NEON, Environmental Data Initiative, the LTR network, and I'm putting a shameless shout out for our Hurricane Ecosystem Response Synthesis Network. September 29th, come join us, and we're on social media. I'd like to thank all of you and all of my colleagues. And I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you, John, very much. A great talk. Remember, please to enter any questions or thoughts into the Q&A box. Our next speaker is Holly Michael from the University of Delaware. Holly, all yours. Thank you.
Thanks. I will share my screen. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay, so thanks for inviting me to be here, and thanks all of you for coming. I'm Holly Michael. I'm at the University of Delaware, and I'm the lead PI on the Coastal Critical Zone Network. We're looking at processes that transform landscapes and fluxes between land and sea. So actually, we have some similar science to what John just described, which is exciting. So maybe we should talk at some point. But this is a collaboration. It's funded by NSF. It's a collaboration among, as of now, 6 different universities, and we hope to expand that in the future. So first, what changes are we seeing at our sites, and is it transferable? This project is all about change. The critical zone along the coast is in transition as marshes are migrating due to coastal change. So we are interested in particular in forests as one ecosystem. So you may have heard about ghost forests. The photo here shows a ghost forest where marsh vegetation is migrating inland, and so the trees have died and the marsh vegetation is there. And this is getting a lot of press. So, the question, is it transferable? Yes, it's transferable. The article on the left is from the Delaware News Journal. So in our study area, of course, this is happening, but it's also happening broadly along coastlines. And it was highlighted here in an article in the New York Times. This is a aerial view of a ghost forest. And so you can see maybe a little bit more clearly how the marshes are migrating into the forest. We're also interested in agricultural transition. Again, this is something that's not just occurring in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia on the Delmarva Peninsula where we're focusing, but it's also happening along many other coastlines. Anywhere that we have low-lying land and agriculture along the coastline, there's vulnerability to this change. And the change is caused by flooding, and it's also caused by salinization. So here you can see sort of a burned out area of an agricultural field. I'll show you one of our sites. We have this as well. That's evidence of salinization of soils. So our network is, as I mentioned, on the Delmarva Peninsula. So that's on the East Coast here, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, the Delmarva. It's between the Delaware Bay, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Chesapeake Bay. We have 3 locations, and each location has 2 sites. So we have at each location a marsh forest transition and a marsh agriculture transition. So our southernmost site is in Virginia. So the Virginia Coast LTER is one of our forested sites, and then we have an agricultural site as well. And this site, it has the highest salinity, it has ocean exposure, and a low topographic gradient. Along the Delaware Bay coast, we also have 2 sites. This one is medium salinity. It's a coastal exposure, but it's in Delaware Bay. So it's a little bit more sheltered and a higher topographic gradient. And then the Chesapeake Bay coast in Maryland with lowest salinity, it's a little bit protected from storms and a medium topographic gradient. And here are 2 of our sites. These are our Virginia sites. This is at the LTER, and our agricultural site. So the second question is, what are the key drivers of these changes? So this is just a schematic of a salt marsh to forest transition where we have tidal flooding in the salt marsh, we have saline groundwater below the marsh, fresh groundwater in the upland, and showing occasional high water mark here. And the idea is that there are fast and slow processes in this marsh upland transition zone that are driving the change. So a slow hydrologic process is sea level rise, for example. So progressively these water levels, both the highs and the lows, are becoming higher. Coastlines are moving inland, which is causing salinization in the intertidal zone. It's causing seawater intrusion in the subsurface. And it's also causing the water table on land to rise. So that will, of course, increase flooding both of saltwater and of freshwater. And then fast hydrological processes are things like high tides and storm surges that occur episodically. And storms are increasing in intensity and frequency with climate change. So all of these things, many of these things are linked to climate change. And so these surges then become higher and higher over time and cause ecological problems. So we see very clearly, or fairly clearly, and we can measure pretty easily, the hydrological and ecosystem changes. So these are apparent, but less apparent are the coupled biogeochemical and geomorphological changes that are also occurring. So our cluster is quantifying the coupled processes and feedbacks that govern the hydrological, ecological, geochemical, geomorphological and biogeochemical transformations in the coastal critical zone to understand how shifts in the transition zone are going to translate to changes in cycling, fluxes, and storage of critical elements at the land sea margin. And this is just an illustration of how we conceptualize that these components work together. So you see the fast and the slow hydrologic processes. These feed back into ecological and geomorphological processes. We also have a hypothesis around trees dying off, roots dying, and changes in elevation, right? So that feeds back into elevation. The hydrology feeds into the biogeochemical processes, which affect fluxes and stores of elements. So we have hypotheses and investigations around all of these couplings. We are making lots of measurements. I don't have time to go through all of them, but hydrology, ecology, biogeochemistry, geomorphology, and modeling. We're just at the end of our first year, so we're just really getting up and running with the instrumentation being installed and starting to get these data that are coming out. And we welcome all of you to engage with us and potentially use our data and collect data along with us. Just to describe how we're collecting some of this, we have transects from marsh up to healthy ecosystems. We have a lot of time series instrumentation, including hydrologic measurements, redox, sap flow sensors, et cetera. And like I said, I don't have time to talk about them all, but this gives you a sense of what we have installed. How are we engaging the broader community? We have meetings planned for researchers, for stakeholders, nationally, internationally. We have workshops, and we also have travel awards to engage faculty and students who haven't, especially who haven't previously been involved in CZ research. And I want to talk in particular about that because I would invite all of you to consider working with us. We have funds for you to come visit, to work at our sites, to visit our labs, have dialogue around the science, and we can cover the travel costs associated with that. So we have applications open for next summer. The deadline is November 19th. And if you're interested, please visit our website or email us or email me and we'll get you connected. So I will stop there. Oops, I'm way over time. Sorry. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Holly. Already seeing some threads of continuity between our talks. Our next speaker is Vanessa Bailey from the Pacific Northwest National Lab. Thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Hi, now let's see, can you hear me? And if I do this right, you should be able to see my screen.
You can hear and see. Looks good. Thanks.
And are you seeing the right part of my screen? That's always the fun part.
No, we're seeing the presenter, your presenter.
Of course you are. Thank you so much. Better?
There you go. Looks great.
Thanks. Awesome. So thanks very much for the invitation. I'm Vanessa Bailey. I'm at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and I'm the lead investigator for one of DOE's newest projects, CUAHSI. It's Coastal Observations, Mechanisms, and Predictions Across Systems and Scales. We're divided into two projects. This is the larger one focused on field measurements and experiments. There's another study on Great Lakes modeling, but they're working at a different level than I think is relevant here. This is a project that includes 4 other national labs in addition to PNNL, as well as the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center and 2 universities, the University of Toledo and Heidelberg University. We're really in the starting phase. We submitted our proposal last year. We got approved for full operations in May. So I think what I'm going to do is I've highlighted the biggest changes, where things are transferable, but I'm going to talk you through some of the thinking and actions that we're doing. Because right now we're just standing up sites and we're at the visiting site stage. So given that CUMPASS is a pilot phase, we have huge aspirations of this being a decadal project, not unlike the next generation ecosystem experiments or Spruce. But we really are emphasizing in this pilot phase, developing the fundamental understanding that we need to inform richer predictions. So we're not really hugely focusing on what disturbance we want to look at. A lot of what Holly told you in her talk is really paralleled here. So I think it's great that there's this energy in the community and in the funding agencies to really get the science done. But during our pilot study, we want to focus on changes in inundation and the shift between aerobic and anaerobic conditions. And in doing that, we're using a multi-scale modeling approach coupled with multi-scale measurements to capture reaction and site scale processes that are going to represent the causes, the mechanisms, and the consequences of the shift between aerobic and anaerobic conditions at both saltwater and freshwater interfaces. So we're really looking across the entire system from that coastal water interface at the shoreline all the way up to the most extreme extent of coastal water influence. So that's crossing from the wetland through the transition zone into the upland coastal forests and other land uses. One of the things that we're very interested in is how understanding the whole system, how soil interacts with sediment, and that fosters environments that change the redox conditions along the landscape, but also how plants and plant changes mitigate and change the redox conditions and the forms and fluxes of carbon and nutrients across these ecosystems. Microbial activity is, of course, a really important element. Ultimately, we do want to move through studies that include these disturbance events, but right now we're trying to understand the baseline conditions so that we can have the fundamental models in place to start to challenge with disturbance, but I will touch on disturbance near the end. So one of the prompts that you gave us was to look at key drivers of change and can they be tested in other regions? Well, that's actually something that our project is really predicated on. Our research plans are being piloted in two of our nationally important regions. And rather interestingly, we're not just looking at marine coasts. So we're looking at the Chesapeake Bay and the Mid-Atlantic, really similar to what Holly's talking about. I think there's some different nuances to what we're doing. And I should say, actually, we have a scientific advisory board and Holly has graciously agreed to sit on it. So if you're looking at this and thinking there's crossovers, I think through that, we're going to make sure there's synergies rather than duplications. But we're also making a strategic investment in our nation's inland coast, the Great Lakes region. These are really interesting because by looking across these two systems and developing sites in the two systems, we're deliberately going to this project with the goal of being able to use compare and contrast studies with sites in both regions to actually build models that can reflect these two extreme conditions. And we're hoping through some of our studies to be able to develop the models so that they can reflect the wide range of parameters that we need to capture rather than simulating a particular site. So this is something that it's difficult for us to bear in mind when we're thinking that freshwater coasts are really different from marine. Because we're using aerobic and anaerobic conditions and inundation as a driver, I think we've got a strong angle to make those connect. But this multi-scale modeling is being paired with ecosystem control points. This is sort of a major element of our research. And that's to improve predictions and transferability across these sites. Between models crossing these sites. And so the control points theory refines hot spots and hot moments into ecosystem features that we think can be more readily incorporated into models in a scalable way. So these are differentiated by basically the persistence of the increased rate and the actual rate, whether it's a slow or active. So we can look at permanent, activated, transport, and export control points. So in translating these into models, we want to make sure, and this leads to a little bit of the community effort, is that we want to build on current capabilities and gaps in common open source models that are being widely used by the DOE community and elsewhere. So we're specifically looking at the E3SM land model, P-Flowtran for some biogeochemical reactions, FATES hydro to couple the vegetation of the system, and a range of microbially explicit models. And so if you think of these control points and these models, it's it's really obvious that we can incorporate control points that describe lateral hydrologic and solute exchanges, coupled biogeochemical transformations in the plant and rhizosphere controls. So these are the things that we're trying to build into the model. So like I said, we're starting right from the beginning with a fundamental goal to have transferable models that are based on research at key sites. This is the one touch that I'm giving to disturbance here, and that's that we've done a very large experiment. We set it up in advance of CUAHSI standing up. And that's our terrestrial ecosystem manipulation to probe the effects of storm treatment. It's called Tempest. And this is centered at one of our fixed sites. And like I said, I didn't really go into our sites because we're in the middle of selecting and going through final permitting processes. But the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is where we've been working for a long time. And for those of you that are familiar with it, you'll see the Tempest experiment in that overhead photograph is in the coastal forest just upland of the G-Crew Marsh. And what this experiment is doing is we're simulating both storm surge and stalled precipitation events on really large 2,000 meter square plots. And we are pumping water from the Road River up so we can have a simulated storm surge flooding the system. And we're also taking fresh water that we're trucking in to simulate a stalled precipitation event. This is a before-after controlled BACI experiment. I'm losing the I, but it's an experiment where it's fundamentally based on having pre-existing data. So we've spent the last several years getting the pre-existing data on rates and processes and tree health and microbial activities. And one of the things we're hoping to do with this, and our running joke is, Holly told you a lot about the ghost forest, and we're really excited about that. Our goal is not to necessarily kill the forest. We just really want to see the trees suffer long enough that we can get good measurements about what's happening in the system. And finally, the community engagement, sharing data, models, and findings. This is something that DOE has asked us to do right from the beginning, and we think it's important. We have a community engagement lead devoted to making sure that we have adequate outreach. We have the Exchange Network, which is based on the Wonders Network some of you may have heard of, where it's exploration of coastal hydrobiogeochemistry across a network of gradients and experiments, where we're going to ask people to send us samples in exchange for being part of large data sets and providing access to some of the EMSL resources that we've contracted with. We're going to have an upcoming virtual seminar series. And then the other thing is that all of our code, scripts, and data are going to be open source through ESS Dive and the archives available through EMSL, JGI, and our other partners. The last pitch I'll make is also the ESS Early Career Researcher Program was announced a couple of weeks ago, and they've specifically asked that people be aware of Compass, and we're welcoming all kinds of collaborations there. So sorry for this quick walk, but thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you, Vanessa, for sharing all of that. It's excellent to see a lot of ecosystem theory being built into these research sites. Our next speaker is Boqiang Qin from the Nanjing Institute for Geography and Limnology. All yours, Dr. Qin.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm from the Nanjing Institute of Geography and Limnology, Chinese Academy of Science, and School of Geography and Oceanology, Nanjing University. Today, I would like to talk about the Taihu eutrophication in association with the climate change and nutrient enrichment. This is a map of China, and you can see Lake Taihu is located in the eastern part of China, very close to Shanghai, in the west to Shanghai. And this is in the catchment of the Taihu Basin. Actually, it is located in the delta of Yangtze River, and this is the most industrialized area in China, and also most urbanized area in China, densely populated. And the lake area is about 2,338 kilometers square, and the maximum depth is about 3 meters. So you can see this is a very large and very shallow system. This lake has many functions, but the most important function is the drinking water supply. In the eastern lake, you can see there are many drinking water factories providing water for the Wuxi, Suzhou, and Shanghai. So the biggest issue of the lake is the eutrophication. In the main In the May 2007, there was drinking water crisis happened in Wuxi, and the local residents used the bottled water instead of tap water for nearly 1 week. After the drinking water crisis, massive efforts has been invested to invest into the different diversion and the interloading reduction, including the construction of wastewater pipeline system and also wastewater treatment plants, and also the bloom collection and the sediment removal. So far, these mitigation measures cost about $14 billion. However, the concentration of total nitrogen declined significantly, and the total phosphorus concentration fluctuated, and the chlorophyll concentration increased. Particularly in the 2017, the chlorophyll concentration reached the highest. The remote sensing observation of annual largest bloom area suggests that the historical record occurred in May 2017. This record setting cyanobacteria bloom was originated from the intense algae bloom in the winter of during 2016 to 2017. At the end of December 2016, the bloom area was as large as 718 kilometers square, which was similar to the bloom area during summertime. This large winter bloom was very unusual. This intensive wind bloom resulted in the largest bloom area in the May 2017. The area was about 1,568 kilometers square, which covered 2/3 area of the lake. Not only that, the intense bloom persisted from the spring through summer to the autumn. In November of the 2017, the bloom area was about 1,420 kilometers square. If you look at the external loading in 2017, it was not the highest. This is the annual mean TN and the TP concentration of the lakes, the blue line, and the annual external loading, the orange line. From the 2006 to 2018, you can see that the external loading of TP in 2017 was not high, but the TP concentration was the highest. Further, we found that the winter and spring temperature is highly correlated to the annual mean bloom area. When we examine the change of the winter and spring air temperature, the spring temperature is the green line, and the winter temperature is the blue line. In the Taihu Basin, we found that the air temperature in winter and spring of the 2017 has been the highest since the 1950s. Because the pH value in the northern lake, Taihu, is highly correlated to the chlorophyll concentration, thus we assume that intense cyanobacteria bloom resulted in the high pH value, which further mobilizes phosphorus released from the sediments to stimulate the phytoplankton growth. Monthly mean dissolved oxygen concentration near the bottom in northern lake during 2008 to 2016 showed a general decline trend, suggesting an increased oxygen depletion. The in situ measurement of the dissolved oxygen at the bottom showed that in this extreme shallow lake, but the hypoxia often happened during summertime. In summary, in Lake Taihu, recent climate change triggered the intense cyanobacteria bloom. Its feedback deteriorated water quality and exacerbate eutrophication. Finally, this is a conclusive remark. The record seeding cyanobacterial bloom in 2017 was a result from the extreme winter warms during 2016 to 2017, which increased the pH value and oxygen depletion and further mobilized the phosphorus release from the sediment to promote the cyanobacterial bloom formation. Strict nutrient emission reduction and aggressive nutrient control strategies are needed to mitigate the cyanobacterial bloom under the condition of climate warming. So the climate change and the nutrient enrichment are two key drivers of the ecosystem change. So thank you very much. So I finished my talk.
Yes, great. Thank you, Boqiang. And our final speaker today is Ian Giesbrecht from the Hakai Institute and Simon Fraser University.
Thanks, Adam. I'm just waiting to be able to screen share.
Oh, Boqiang, if you could, I think you're still sharing your screen. If you could end that, please.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Should I?
In your Zoom controls, probably.
I cannot see where is the button of the stop the.
Is it potentially if you move your cursor over your, there we go. Great. Thank you.
I found it. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And seeing your slides, Ian, they look good. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'll jump right
Thank you.
in. Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, Adam. Yeah, I'm Ian Giesbrecht, an ecosystem scientist with the Hakai Institute and a concurrent PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University. So I'll present a quick overview of the CUAHSI Watersheds Observatory. And I'm doing that on behalf of a large group of collaborators, including all of the fine folks shown here. So the CUAHSI Watersheds Observatory is located on the central coast of British Columbia, Canada, in the coastal temperate rainforest, more specifically along the hypermaritime coastline, where the ocean moderates the temperatures such that the high precipitation we receive is largely in the form of rain. The geology here is largely quartz diorite lithology with limited areas of quaternary sediments over the bedrock. And the catchments are generally small, low relief to moderate relief catchments that have they're undeveloped and unlogged, unregulated. Yet it's important to recognize that the landscape has at least 13,000 years and counting of continuous indigenous peoples' presence in the landscape. So in this setting, our goal is to understand the role of small rain-dominated watersheds in contributing to land-sea connectivity at the margin of coastal temperate rainforests in the context of long-term environmental change. Apologies for my voice. I do have a minor cold, but I promise to keep physically distanced, so we should be okay. So to achieve this goal, we set up 7 observatory catchments that drain into CUAHSI Channel, characterized the catchments using geospatial mapping technologies, set up a sensor network for near real-time continuous observation of streams, weather conditions, etc., and established a routine monthly sampling program complemented by high-flow event-based sampling in streams and in adjacent estuarine sites. Some of the key findings over the years so far, and I think I needed to mention that we started that in 2013. So we've learned that the area has extensive wetlands, bog forests that are dominated by short, slow-growing trees. The soils of the area have accumulated large amounts of organic matter and thus have quite high soil organic carbon stocks. The soils are sandy with little clay or iron in them. And this combination of these conditions combine with the high rainfall and high runoff to generate very high, like a global hotspot of runoff yields for dissolved organic carbon, dissolved organic nitrogen, and iron to the coastal ocean per unit area. We've seen some evidence that this export of organic matter subsidizes microbial production in the estuary, and we're looking into new interesting questions around possible remineralization and influences on the productivity of phytoplankton as well as zooplankton. So other current areas of interest include looking into how we can scale up from local observations like this using catchment characteristics to model across broader complex geographies. And finally, last but not least, we're looking into how critical zone processes, specifically mineral weathering, might be contributing to some of the extreme characteristics and runoff from these watersheds. And that's done in a collaboration with other sites within the critical zone exploration network. So to the prompts, the biggest changes that we're anticipating for this relatively new observatory are related to climate, given that they are protected watersheds. More specifically, we're anticipating wetter wet seasons, especially associated with more frequent atmospheric river events that produce very intense rain, drier and warmer summer seasons, and likely increased chance of landslides. So we expect this to translate into changing catchment processes in terms of increased runoff and higher peak flows, more dramatic water table fluctuations, and late summer flushing events, which we know are important, and increased total annual exports of dissolved and particulate organic matter, and a general increase in the importance of storms for linking the terrestrial and aquatic systems here at the rainforest margin. We have a number of uncertainties around these predictions, and these are in fact identified amongst the most important knowledge gaps at the regional scale in the coastal temperate rainforest of North America in a recent review. So we anticipate that our site will have transferable results across that region and perhaps across other coastal temperate rainforests globally. So we are engaging with global communities through participation in research networks, including the Coastal Rainforest Margins Research Network here on the west coast of North America, as well as the Critical Zone Exploration Network, both of which are funded by the National Science Foundation. We also try to reach a broader audience by working with our media team to generate blogs, videos, and social media posts. And finally, how are we sharing our data? We routinely publish data packages to a data repository and recently contributed a summary of 20 data packages to the special issue of hydrological processes on research and observatory catchments. So if any of this catches your interest, please do reach out. We're always looking for opportunities to engage global communities in broader scale assessments of small watersheds at the coastal margin or small watersheds more broadly. So I'll just end by thanking you all for your attention and thanking the folks listed here and the organizations here for their important contributions to this work.
Great, thank you, Ian, for that talk, and thank you to all of our speakers for their talks today. To other participants out there, please, if you do have questions or thoughts, to enter them in the Q&A, and the moderators, we can pick them up there and present them to the group. While we're waiting for entries into the Q&A, I thought I could start with one question. And theme among the talks, of course, was disturbance. And I was struck, John, in your presentation, one of your slides, you kind of had a time series of disturbance events. And Holly, you picked up on them too, and we could see them throughout the different talks. But one thing I was wondering about is kind of starting to parse out different signals when we start getting disturbances stacked on top of one another. And especially when one is a more like a press disturbance, like drought or land use change, And then we put pulse disturbances like fires or hurricanes, of course, which all have legacy effects. But thoughts just kind of generally about how we pull apart the different effects of these different disturbance regimes as they're getting stacked upon one another. For anybody who wants to take that one.
That's the $1 million question. I mean, there's trade-offs. We've been able to track pulse events like storm surge or a fire and see where it goes physically over time, spatially over time, I should say. But sometimes these diffuse effects, and so like sea level rise is a diffuse effect, but in our system, cold snaps from 2010, 2011 were really diffuse, and we saw wide scale long-term effects in some parameters, our bacterial productivity. So it was hard to pinpoint that, but I think maybe the way to do it is to look at those that are mediated by the scale of the driver versus the scale of the impact, and playing around with those a little bit, and where they're stacked. I don't know, I'm gonna let others think about that.
I'd actually really like to comment on this, because this is something I think about a lot. And some of the work that I've done in advance of CUAHSI was a project where we're really looking at mechanisms. Like, I'm unusual. I'm not a coastal scientist. I don't have a degree in oceanography. I'm a hardcore soil scientist, but I study mechanisms, which translates really well to different systems. And some of what we've done is looked at what is the effect of an antecedent moisture condition on a current behavior. So we've done a lot of experiments and published pretty extensively on what happens if we simulate a drought in a soil or simulate a flood in a soil for an extended period of time, and then bring both soils to experience a common event. How does that change? And so we've really begun to tease out that there are legacy effects, at least with respect to the soil part, that come out of experiencing a drought or a flood. And some of the work is that we're looking at is that it's the physical properties of the soil that control how water interacts with the soil. So water is not just a solvent, it's also a connective agent through the soil. And as that goes away, we get really steep changes in ionic strength at the pore scale, or massive dilution, and that changes the chemistry within a soil pore. And then what happens is it changes the quality of carbon that is desorbable, and then that changes the type of carbon the microbes have to respond to, so then they go through a particular metabolic process. And what we found is that that antecedent moisture condition follows through all of these chain reactions to that microbial action. Our next step is to connect that to how that leads to feedbacks. But this is one of the things we're looking at, is trying to connect the physical controls, the chemical environment, and the biological consequences. So that's the kind of systematic thing we're looking at. It's really hard, though, when you're thinking about landscape scale events and pore scale responses, but we're trying very, very hard. And I think that's one way to link PRESS to pulse.
If I could just comment quickly too. Yeah, I completely agree with what John and Vanessa said. And we're also trying to take a mechanistic approach. And the other aspect, the other thing that we're doing is a lot of continuous monitoring, because the processes, like we said, are occurring on all different timescales. And the hope, so many of our sites already have long time series data sets for certain things, especially the hydrology. And so we're superimposing that on that, anything that we can, the redox, the sap flux, various indicators that can be continually monitored. And then we're working with one of the other critical zone networks to apply data science tools on these time series and things like that, so we can start to draw correlations between, across time scales and among different variables. So that's another approach that we're trying to take with the instrumentation that we're installing.
I can add a quick response on that as well. I think these are all great points as far as capturing, being able to characterize and understand those pulse events. One further thought is, we need to continue our systematic observations in the places we've invested in, while also being ready to quickly mobilize when an event occurs and jump on that opportunity. And so we've had an example of that on the BC coast recently with a glacial lake outburst flood that occurred in Butte Inlet late November last year, and just happened to have some prior data and mobilized quickly to get in there and characterize that. And it's become quite an opportunity.
I think this is a terrific discussion. And one of the things I think that has a little bit come to light, which was a question that I was interested in asking, since many of the people who are on this call are early career folks, oftentimes, postdocs or graduate students, maybe even looking to transition to the next step. A lot of them are being encouraged to do cross-site research, right? To really think about how like at an even larger scale of transferability. And I was just wondering what kind of advice you might have for those types of students who are now transitioning or postdocs. How might they start to make these kinds of steps?
Yes, into the silence, I'll step. Right now, I think your question is really interesting because we're also still in the throes of a global pandemic. So, my pat answer is network. But I think that it's different during a global pandemic when you're at an early career stage, in that we're not getting the same exposure at conferences to somebody seeing your talk or you seeing somebody, like those after conference conversations. So I'm just going to put this pitch here, is that some of our early career staff and postdocs at PNL are trying to come up with creative ways to create these networks, to build these bridges. For instance, Holly, there's somebody at the lab who really wants to meet you. We're going to make that happen sometime. But also thinking about ways to be really strategic and create maybe a set of curated talks at the American Geophysical Union that would bring different sites together, and through Twitter, maybe connect. Does anybody else want to see the same set of talks? And then we'll convene, a Zoom chat where we can have like the hallway conversation with people maybe we wouldn't have reached before. So my advice would be to network, but to think about how networking can happen during a global pandemic. And you may find that it's a lot more creative. I was watching Ian's talk and thinking about, you're way closer to me on Vancouver Island, I'm in Washington State, than the two sites I'm actually working at. I want to come visit you, can I? So, making these outreach, like doing these really bold things, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree. And while the pandemic is a challenge, it also, Zoom brings us closer, right? So it may in some ways be easier now to connect because you can hop on a Zoom chat. And so I think the key is to be proactive and contact the people you're interested in working with, and you may be surprised that they may be excited. And like in our case, we have some funds dedicated to that. So my advice would be, don't be shy and let people know that you're interested in working together.
Holly, I'd like to work with you. All of y'all.
I'd like to work with you too.
All of y'all, but I think put yourself out there as an early career or even a late career as a scientist. Put yourself out there, and I think the Pacific Northwest National Labs is doing a lot of really cool, innovative work, collaborative work, and just be a team player.
I did drop one thing in the chat I think is really exciting and people aren't doing enough, but all of these projects talked about our data being open source. Go get that data. You can do a meta-analysis of experiments from the different PIs here that we're not scoped to do, or come up with hypotheses, and I think you can, like, people who can really creatively bring these projects together can create their own niche too.
Well, I think that's wonderful. We really want to thank you all for being here. Adam and Bhavna, I don't know if you want to say something. I know it's 10 o'clock now.
This was amazing. Thank you to all the panelists and everybody who could join us. I think CUAHSI will upload this on their YouTube channel. The previous seminars do exist, so if you're bored, go ahead and watch those. We'll be sharing the link with you guys soon. Thank you, Adam and Pam, for this fantastic webinar. Adam?
Yeah, our pleasure, and thank you to all our speakers. This is a great series of talks, so many threads of continuity and opportunities there, emphasizing open data and participation across career stages. So thank you to everybody, and have a great day.